Word of caution, I do work in marketing. I'm going to try very hard not to have any of that on the slides today. I present a lot, and normally I can fall back on the fact that I usually know more than most of the people I'm presenting to. And the last 2 days I've been shaking for this presentation because I'm pretty sure in this audience I'm not even in the top 100. So bear with me, a little bit of nerves, but we're going to talk about securing mobility in enterprise. So Gregor's not in here to enjoy this, but earlier when I told him that I woke up and I was really not having a good morning, I was very, very nervous for this presentation, he said, well, as long as I put guns, cars, and women, that you guys would be okay with the presentation. So I added this for oh my God, I'm sorry. High school football, next time. And the barbecue. I had barbecue last night. Maybe that's why my stomach's upset. No. So, what's the first thing that you do in the morning? You wake up. Yeah. We've heard that 84% of people check their smartphone. I'm guessing in this audience it's more like 100%. I know it's the first thing I do when I get up in the morning. We see that 67% of people check their email. Weather is 45%. That is not good. Facebook's another 40%. And then for those of us that are still single in the audience, there's still a solid 3% checking their online dating first thing in the morning. So we know that people are using these devices from the time they get up in the morning until they fall asleep at night. And if we look at where that problem began, timeline back in 1999, we really didn't have to worry about mobile devices at all, right? But in 2003, we started to see laptops coming with Wi-Fi in them. I know I would walk around and I'd sit in a conference room and I'd be like, oh, well, maybe there'll be Wi-Fi in here so I can stay connected during my meeting. By 2007, we had 11N. Now we're starting to see more and more devices. That's also when our iPhones and iPads showing up. Last year, starting to see these at gigabit speeds. And now today, what we're seeing is that Wi-Fi is really the only way to connect. So when we talk about scale for what we're looking at for devices, we are finally starting to see one per user as far as laptops go. It seems like we would be there a long time ago. We work in tech, so I know many of you commented on the tweet that Matthew sent out yesterday. Most of our bags are probably filled with 5 or 6 or 7 devices, but we aren't actually the use case. But in general, we've got about a 1-to-1 ratio for laptops starting to show up in the enterprise. With BYOD and consumerization of IT, as we start planning our networks, we're looking at more like 3 clients per user. And now these wearables that are showing up, I've seen a couple of them this week already. We're telling people maybe you should start planning for 5 clients per user that they're going to connect to the network. But the one that's really worrying is what's starting to show up this year. And this is the Internet of Things. This is something you can't even tie to the number of users that are on your network. So how do you plan for infinite? And that's something that we're talking to a lot of our customers about, and they're struggling with is, how do we know the network's going to scale when we don't even know how many devices are going to be here tomorrow, let alone in 6 months or the 5 years that I normally need to use to plan for my network? Like I said, most of these devices are shipping without a network cable. In fact, ABI told us that 6 billion devices shipped that were Wi-Fi enabled last year. So it's a huge problem. And the problem is that we have an entire generation of people that have been taught it's all about them. From the fact that we don't share a pot of coffee anymore, to the fact that we can customize the shoes that go on our feet. This generation of people says, I want to do what I want. As soon as you add mobile devices to that mix, now we have a wildly diverging set of expectations. We as users are going, I want to connect whatever device I have, wherever I am in the world, and I want to get my work done. And the IT team's going, how am I going to do that? Keep all of our data secure? How am I going to manage it? How am I going to plan for that? Make sure that these guys are connected. So when wireless used to be simple, you could just create 2 SSIDs, assume one of them was the devices that you were connecting, you owned that device, your users were connecting it, you knew what applications were on it, those were your corporate resources, and you had your guest network. Now we're starting to see people create 5 and 6 SSIDs trying to account for guests and employees with BYO devices, and then there's the parents that are coming in that need their own special access to systems. All these different networks with all sorts of different policies across a bunch of different offices makes this problem really complex. And in fact, because networks were built originally, a lot of people still falling back on the old, let's just have a guest and an employee network. What we heard is that 41% of CIOs are pretty sure that their network would not pass a security audit. You may see this in your networks too. Sometimes it's easier just to pretend that we don't know everything that's going on. So when we look at mobility, we know we have all these different users out there, different devices that they're connecting, applications, and then of course, where are they in the world? And I made each one of these get bigger, not because each one is worse than not because each problem is bigger than the last one, but because when you put them together, the combination of those things becomes a bigger and bigger problem that we have to struggle to figure out how to deal with. And in the end, what we really need is visibility. So let's figure out how to get visibility into what's happening on the network. If we take a step back, there's 5 major use cases that we can identify for how users interact with the network. There's your typical guest. This is your transient guest user visiting your network. They come into the building. They say, I'm going to be here for an hour, 2 hours, a week. I need a credential to get me online. There's also the employees with a personal device. This is a truly personal device they've brought in because it's probably their smartphone, maybe a tablet. They plan to, they want to offload the 3G, 4G data. This is usually what happens. I want to connect it to the Wi-Fi so that I'm not paying for data. They're not really planning to do a lot of work on that device. To the right of that one is the more traditional BYO example, where this user did bring in a device from home, and they do expect to do corporate work with it. The one to the right of that is the corporate device. This is the one that's been issued to the user for some business purpose, usually a laptop. I'm not sure why I have an iPhone there other than it was really late when I was making these slides. And then the one on the far right, this is a device that's been issued or BYO, but it's for a very specific purpose. This is like a kiosk in a retail store that's taking credit card transactions, or in a healthcare facility being used for EMR. Very, very tightly controlled user experience where you don't want any content or applications on that device that you didn't explicitly authorize to be there. So of course, what we're talking about here is how much control you're going to need over these devices as you start figuring out how to connect them to the network. But what we need to do first is figure out how are we going to connect them to the network. Because if the goal is visibility and to figure out how to control them, we know who's going to connect now. Now we have to figure out how are we going to connect them so that we can get that visibility. And sadly, what we still see on a lot of networks are open SSIDs. And as you can see, when I put that security there, I had to preface it with none. I'm hoping, certainly working for a Wi-Fi vendor, our goal is to never see an open SSID again. And the pineapples won't be quite so dangerous, right? But never probing for an open SSID. So it's pretty much saying, come steal our data. Hidden SSIDs. This is another one. Maybe you guys see this out in the networks that you're configuring. This is no longer security either. This is pretty much saying, oh, of course, we don't see that SSID, but we just saw a tool that could show us any one of those BSSIDs out there. So this takes a couple minutes. Hidden SSIDs are not a form of security to connect to the network. WEP is another one. We can crack this one in, 30 seconds now? There's probably a dozen apps you can do this. So WEP is also not a great way to connect these users to the network, especially not as you're starting to think about how am I going to make them all compliant and how am I going to be able to see what they're doing once they're there. It's also going to really slow down your networks. For anybody still using WEP, it will not run at the speeds that you would expect, even if you get a new AP. Mac-based security. Is anybody still using this? I hope not. So we're saying, you know, you have to have a matching MAC address in order to connect to that access point. We're going, that's so easy to change a MAC address, to spoof a MAC address now. That's also not secure. So then we come to WPA2 PSK. This is pretty common, right? Everybody's got pre-shared key. Most of the devices are supporting it. We're saying, okay, this is an acceptable way. It's a strong password. It's not completely unhackable, of course, but now you're at least making it more difficult. So it's good, you have the password. Problem is, now you've got multiple users connecting with that same password. So what happens at the network level? If our goal is visibility, this isn't going to provide it because everybody's connecting with the same password and they all are going to look the same. Yes, you can see them by MAC address, but you're not going to be able to differentiate what permissions they have on the network or say, hey, this is Keith with a BYO device versus with a, you know, a corporate issued device, because they're all using the same password to connect. And then the biggest problem is if somebody leaves or you need to deauth one of those devices, what are you going to do? You have to change the password for everybody connecting to that SSID. So that's not going to provide the visibility. And then we go into radius. So hopefully you guys have figured out that I'm hoping that we all start using 802.1x as a standard for connecting to the network, because even in this case, you're going to have to get someone to give personal credentials in order to connect to the network. Even if they do, we can still negotiate an individual password for every client that's connected. We know who they are. We can deauth them without deauthing everybody on the network. But now we have another problem. Because you've used a username and password to connect multiple devices to the network, what happens with the consumerization of IT? And now we've got Abby with a tablet that I've been given for a specific purpose, and that same tablet that I've brought in from home. And this is happening a lot. So how do you differentiate the one that's issued, that IT has actually given me and said, this is what you're supposed to do with it, versus the personal device that I've brought in from home? So now we need to start talking about device certificates. And as we get into 802.1x, I figured this was something I probably could actually talk about that might be interesting to a room full of geeks. Because one of the things that we're seeing is, okay, yes, we start to use 802.1x, but we're all using PEEP. Why don't we use TLS? What are the obstacles to getting there? So if we take a look at the biggest problem, it is normally that PKI, I've actually been asked how to spell that when I was out at a site. They're like, oh, can you tell me how to spell that so I can look it up? So that's where we are most of the time. Chris and I were actually talking the other night, and it was funny, this came up completely unprompted even before I knew I was going to present this. Not that I was working on my slides at 11 o'clock last night. Never happened. But it was interesting because he said, this is the problem our customers are struggling with. And I'm going, yeah, we're seeing the same thing. Certificates are hard. So if we look at what 802.1x does, at the 802.11 level, it's the same as always, right? We're making an association request. We're getting the response back. What we're doing in 802.1x is saying, hey, give me your identity. We request, talks to the radius server, wherever that may be, spits back a response, hey, you're allowed to connect to the network. This works wired or wireless. I'm just showing you the wireless piece here with the associations. There's two different ways that you can use TLS in 802.1x. The first one is the more traditional way most people think of when we say EAP TLS. This is using certificates both on the client side and on the radius server side. They're mutually authenticating each other in order to connect to the network. There's another way that you can use TLS, which is to protect PEEP or TTLS. You notice I put legacy authentication methods up there. These were invented back by Funk and Cisco, 2003 or something. It's been a while. Maybe even before that. It's a long time ago. You know, these were protocols where they said, we need to try to figure out how to get users onto the network. Mostly from the wired side, remember, because it wasn't a huge wireless problem back then. But what they were doing is saying, it's too hard to get a certificate on every device, so let's just use a credential that we already know that they have in order to connect those users to the network. One of the problems with these compound authentication methods, because those were invented not by standards bodies. Remember I mentioned they were invented by Funk and Cisco and kind of brought into the market that way. It was a good way to get users to connect, start using 802.1x on the network. The problem with that is that when you use TLS in a compound situation, these weren't protocols that were developed to work together. Just because you had the ability to request credentials doesn't mean you necessarily authenticate it and know which both of the endpoints are. It works a lot like IPsec, actually. So if you think about IPsec, when we transitioned from having to do main mode every time to quick mode, the reason that you could do that in phase 2 is because phase 1 was very, very clear about who your endpoints were. You know that we knew who the authenticator was and who the response person was, and that was how we knew when we got to phase 2 that it would be okay to do quick mode because we've already established who the endpoints are. There is no such thing in EAP. Unless you're using TLS to authenticate both the requester and the authentication server, there's no, hey, we know exactly who the endpoints are. So one of the biggest problems with PEEP and TTLS is that they are susceptible to man in the middle. And that means because they're not strongly bound to those endpoints. So what happens there is that the attacker can actually say, let's do PEEP. You send them your credentials, and they go, oh, well, no. Let's do TLS inside PEEP. And then all of a sudden, now you've got a tunnel created with a man in the middle rather than the actual authenticator that you were expecting. Any comments on this? Are you guys seeing this at all? So, should give you a warning. You already saw it though. So a little bit of marketing. I did put 2 little asterisks up there. I'm going to show you how AeroHive solves this problem because I know how AeroHive solves this problem. I can also do demos because I have access to all of those systems. However, we also know that other vendors can solve this problem. Of course, not as well. But they can do it. But I want to talk about, so we know that we should be using device certificates. We know that we should be using them, that would be the gold standard of getting all of these devices connected so that we can then provide differentiated access and secure access to these users. How do we get there? How can we start getting our customers and making it easier for our users to connect all of these different devices in the most secure way? And so the way that we solve it is that we created an application called Client Management, which allows a user to connect with their PEEP credentials, or TTL, it doesn't really matter, but with their username and password to an 802.1x SSID. We are going to authenticate them against whatever directory is out there, establish that tunnel. We'll check to see if they're already enrolled with our Client Management application. We can also match it against a list of known corporate issued devices. And then if it's not enrolled, we're going to redirect them to an enrollment page. And I can show you this in just a couple seconds. And then we can reconnect them to the same SSID, now using a secure device certificate instead of just their username and password. This gives you EAP TLS without having to configure every endpoint with a device certificate. There are other products that can do this. I mentioned that. But I want to make sure this is the way forward in Wire. This is the way that we have to start differentiating devices, is putting these secure device certificates on that device. And then you can apply policies based on all of that context, because now we not only know who the user is, what device it is, where they are in the network, but we know exactly who owns that device. We know exactly the signature of that device. They can't use that secure credential to connect any other device. Yes? Ours does not yet work with Windows. Other vendor products do, though. And so this single SSID onboarding experience is pretty unique. There are only a couple vendors that are currently supporting this functionality. Chris is pretty familiar with another one, which is ClearPass, also does this. One big differentiator is that we do it for Chrome OS, which they do not yet on the single SSID, but they have Windows support. So if you're looking at Windows, there are other options. And ClearPass works with Arrowhive.
What's the experience in step 5? I mean, what are they clicking something, hitting an install button, or is it transparent to them?
I can show you that, actually. Well, maybe, if my demo works today. The end user experience. So that's one of the problems with consumer devices, right, is that they are very focused on the user experience rather than on being the best possible business device. So you can't forcefully install anything on an end user device. What they get is redirected to that enrollment portal. It says, who are you? Are you bringing in, we know whether or not it's a corporate issued or BYO device. And then it'll go, are you going to trust the certificate? That can either be an Arrowhive provided certificate, because we've actually implemented a certificate authority in our solution, just because, as I mentioned, most of our customers really struggle implementing PKI. If you have your own PKI infrastructure, of course you can use that also. So they may already implicitly trust that based on other things that they've accepted from that company's certificate authority. But they'll get a, hey, do you trust this? And then we're actually going to push an enrollment profile to that device. Either on Android, it's an app, Chrome OS, it's an app, and for iOS and OS X, it just is an enrollment profile. And what that enrollment profile does is gives us a way to configure the Wi-Fi for them and reconnect them with the ETLS certificate. Yes? That's a great question. So is client management a Radius server, or is it, or can you use your corporate Radius server? You would absolutely be using your corporate Radius server. What client management is a cloud-based application that allows you to, we can issue certificates if you need it, and we can use the APN and the Android and Google, I'm sorry, Android and Google push capabilities to put those profiles and apps on the device. But it is not authenticating the user. The users are authenticating to your local Radius. Oh, another good question. So he asked, because client management is cloud-based, does it have to be online at all times? Absolutely not. These devices, once they're connected to the network, are just using ETLS to connect to the network. All we've done there is put a secure certificate on there so you can differentiate them when they're connected. If they lose contact with the cloud-based application, what you might lose is visibility into exactly what's happening on that device at that moment, but they're not losing functionality. If they want to enroll another device, you do have to have access to the application, because that's the only way to get access through to APN, the Apple push notification capability. And that would be true, actually. One of the things that comes up a lot is with ClearPass, which is an awesome product, by the way. It is really good. I've played with it a lot. Is they go, okay, well, this is on premises versus cloud. But one of the limitations on that is that in order to enroll any of these mobile devices, you still have to be connected to the cloud, because it is the only way that Apple has authorized pushing enrollment profiles to the device. Same thing for Android and Chrome. So where the actual service resides is not as critical as the fact that you do have to be connected in order to get these devices online. So this does, yes, please. Oh, that's another good question. So are we using like SCEP or anything? Yeah, well, of course, we have to use SCEP to push certificates. But the actual certificate authority is not in the cloud. The certificate authority actually resides on Hive Manager for us, and the certificates are pushed to every AP as, I'm sorry, every authenticator AP. But the same thing. It is. I mean, we're not authenticating against the cloud, I guess is. Yeah, yes. Well, the SCEP is, that piece is built into client management, because that's the piece that we need APN and Android and Chrome, or Google for. This allows us to personalize the mobile experience. This is what our entire goal is, right? Because one of the problems that we see is that what's important to the user visiting the coffee shop is likely not the same thing that's important to the person running that coffee shop. And so we have to be able to differentiate the permissions and how these users are interacting with the network. And what we've seen from our friends at Gartner, I know it's another marketing statistic, but I like this one because it shows that 90% of enterprises have already deployed mobile devices. So this isn't something that we can say, oh, this isn't a huge problem. It's a problem. Probably you're seeing it even more than me. One of the other cool things that I was just seeing is that by 2016, nearly 40% of enterprises expect to stop issuing devices altogether. They may still issue a stipend and say, go get what you want to be productive, but they're not planning on continuing to issue devices. And in fact, for some of the customers that I've actually met here this week, they've been telling us they're already all BYO, because why would they choose what device those users want to connect with when the user is going to connect whatever they wanted anyway? So, we can do some demos. I think we have time. Yes. Any questions while I'm switching over? Yes, please.
On iOS, when you reach that 5, is that machinery like do you receive that as package for it?
It's in Safari, actually. That's a good question, because it's something that I've seen as a sticking point in all of the products that we've played with so far, is that Apple does not see that enrollment, redirect to an enrollment, as a true captive web portal. And so they don't pop up the automatic, hey, you can't truly get online until you open a browser. Do you have a comment on that one? Or? Yeah. Because this is a limitation, and I've actually seen it across all of the products that can do this so far, is that you do have to open a browser, and then we can redirect you. It doesn't get detected by the automatic iOS captive web portal piece of it. The what? I'm sorry? If you're using your own certificate or with our certificate? Right, but certificate validation basically what it is. It's a preemptive check, go online, it's like this is a valid cert. Right, well they will be valid certs, right? Because they're approved by an authority that's pre-configured in. No, because it's tied to Apple's push notifications, same thing for Android. So no, those are all the major signing authorities are already because certain other vendors you actually have to write extension rules to allow that kind of include in order to validate the certificate to I have not yet seen that. I can take note, I'll find out, and if you leave me an email or something, I can get back to you. I just don't know off the top of my head. I have not seen that happen ever, so. Yes, we can, but we don't have to. No. Okay.
Right, you have to let the validate certificate that's being used for reasons
basically, iOS will read the cert that you're giving to us, look at the trust, we'll look at the revocation, and we'll try to talk to the cert to verify. Right. We can't talk to the American trust.
You need the CSPC or
yeah, right. It needs to be up, it needs to be accessible for us.
Yeah. So, exactly.
Right. Right, and you have complete control over the walled garden at all times, so you could, I mean, I haven't run into it, but you'd be able to configure your server in there if you needed to. Oh, this isn't the pretty one. This is the one I've been using for the demo. No, I have so many demo servers set up because this is a tough one, right? One of the other things I was thinking about talking about today, but just ran out of time, is how do we entice users to want this on their devices? Because I know certainly a lot of us, as we're getting more and more information about what happens once you have control over a device, we'll go, yeah, there's no way I'm putting a profile on my device. You can see, you have a lot of visibility into what is happening on that device. So one of the other problems, once we solve the fact that we should all be doing this, we have to figure out how to entice all the users that they want it to, and make it a carrot or stick capability where you say, well, if you want to use the Wi-Fi, this is the way to get them on board. And then maybe also still have a basic guest network where you do allow people to connect, but they don't have any access to corporate resources or any, maybe they're rate limited, whatever you do to say, okay, well, there is a guest network, but it's pretty painful. If you want true access from your devices, especially as an employee, you're going to want to sign in and do that. All right. So this is what it looks like from the Arrowhive side. Again, there's ClearPass can do this. Meraki has a system manager Sentry capability that has this as well. This is the visibility that you get from the device. You can see down to exactly this. You can see the details of the certificate. You can see how many devices a user is connected to the network. You get a lot of information about what's happening on the devices. One of the really cool things I wanted to show off, because I think this is going to be the next cool thing that could happen with these devices, as we get more and more enrolled on the network and we get more and more capability to see what's happening at those device levels. One of the really cool things that you can do with Android and Chrome devices is you can see exactly what they see from their device. You can see all the BSS IDs, you can see all the RSSI values, so a complete network scan from the device itself. So if you think about what you could start doing as you combine this at the network infrastructure level, now we go, well, we think we're covering this amount of area with any given access point. We think that the RSSI values are X. Now we can truly see it from any of the connected clients and start troubleshooting capabilities by going, oh, well, when they get to this part of the building, this is all we see. I mean, and you saw it with the Android apps that Peter was showing off yesterday, some of the Eckhouse. When you start combining that level of visibility with how they're interacting at the network level, there's a lot of cool stuff, I think, that's going to start happening there. So another great reason to start getting devices enrolled and have that unique certificate on there is that now you can start customizing their access as well as how they're going to interact with the network.
So what you're saying is iOS plus protect user privacy far more. That's all I'm saying.
Well,
The second point actually is, so relative to PKI infrastructure, have you seen or have you had any recommendations on what type of server that needs to be relative